I'm Steve Little from Capacity Act Consulting in Australia. Thank you for having me at your workshop today. So yeah, I want to give you the Australian experience on dairy cattle feed efficiency, and maybe just to sort of set the scene. A few years ago, I learned how to fly a plane, sort of part of my ongoing midlife crisis, I guess you would call it. But if you look at the instruments that you use to fly a plane, there's a number of them, and I think a plane is not unlike a dairy farm. You know, we rely on those instruments to get a sense of how we're travelling, and obviously the first dials we look at are the ones that relate to the financial health of the business, the net farm income and return on assets, and then we start to look at some of the more financial and physical indicators. So, you know, we can look at production per cow, we can look at how many litres of kilos of milk per kilo of body weight or per hectare of land, and then there's a number of indicators that really describe the way the feeding system on the farm is operating. And you know, probably four of the main ones would be how much grass the cows are harvesting, what the rations cost, how much margin there is over the feed, and the other one that really should be there is feed efficiency. So that's what I want to talk about. So I want to talk about the conceptual and practical challenges that feed efficiency puts in front of us, and how we've approached things here in Australia, and the mistakes we've made and what we've learned along the way. And I'm speaking to you thanks to Dairy Australia, which is the equivalent body to DairyCo in Australia, whom I've done work in this area for. So when we think about making money from dairy production, here's a rather simple diagram that shows just what's involved, and you can see in the fine print there, feed conversion efficiency is sort of embedded in there, and they're in between feed costs, feed intake, milk production per cow. So it's embedded in the dynamics of the system. And when we talk about feed efficiency with farmers and advisors in Australia, I'm always conscious that there's these challenges that we have to deal with. Feed efficiency, typically we're talking about a ratio of milk production divided by feed intake. Ratios are problematic and they're difficult for many people to get their head around at the best of times. We're also sometimes unsure about whether we should be talking in terms of kilograms or dollars, pounds. There's also many ways in which we can express milk output. We can talk raw litres, we can talk fat-corrected milk, energy-corrected milk, kilos of milk solids. There's different ways to do that. We can think about the entire diet, i.e. the pasture plus all the other components of the diet, or we can just simply be talking about the marginal feed efficiency of the last kilo that we feed. Timescale, we can talk about annual feed efficiency, monthly, today's feed efficiency. We can talk about the milking herd, or we can talk about all the animals on the farm. We can talk about the feed that we put in front of the cows, or we can talk about what actually goes down their throats. We've always got the challenge of how do we measure pasture intake. I'll talk about that later. Do we have different targets for different feeding systems, or is it a one-size-fits-all proposition? How much can we gain from the way we manage the feed and the herd versus genetic selection? And if we are going to go down the genetic route, then how we're going to describe that trait and how we're going to talk about net efficiency or gross efficiency. So it's no wonder it's a challenge for everybody, this concept of feed efficiency. And my sense is that there's considerable variation between individual farmers and consultants providing nutritional advice in the way they interpret this concept of feed efficiency. And you know, we haven't got to the bottom of this yet. That deserves a social science research study in its own right. But it's very important, because if we're going to expect farmers to embrace this, we really need to be able to pitch it in terms that they're happy to understand and use, and we've got to design tools that fit in with that as well. Now, in Australia, I guess we've got probably the most diverse range of feeding systems of any country in the world. Probably we've got, you know, the Irish, New Zealand pasture dominant system in the top right there, and we've got a number of intermediate systems that involve component feeding, if you want to use that word, with pasture, and we've got some farms in Australia that are fully housed total mixed ration systems. So that presents some challenges for us when we talk about feed efficiency. About 4 or 5 years ago now, with a number of others, we developed a feeding systems classification, and we came up with 5 main systems. And here they are. I'll just go through them briefly. So the lowest intensity system is number 1, and that's grazed pasture, perhaps some other conserved forages, and up to 1 tonne of grain or grain-based concentrates fed in the dairy parlour. And then we move to system 2, where it's very much the same, but we're feeding higher levels of starch-based concentrates to cows in slugs twice a day in the dairy at milking. And then there's quite a significant shift from system 2 to system 3 and 4, which involve mixed rations, what we term partial mixed ration system, where the cows are still grazing most of the year, but they're presented with a mixed ration that could be pretty basic, might only have 3 or 4 ingredients, and they might also still be getting a small amount of grain in the dairy at milking, but that requires them to have a feed pad and a mixer wagon of some description. System 4 is similar to 3, except that in some of the harsher areas of Australia where water is limiting, we don't attempt to grow grass over the summer months, so we effectively feedlot cows for 3 or 4 months over the summer, and then go back to a PMR pasture-based system the rest of the year. And system 5 is your housed TMR system. So they're the 5 systems, and it's been useful for us to ask our dairy farmers 3 or 4 questions, which very quickly drops them into one of those 5 systems, and it's useful for us to monitor the regional differences in farmers' choice of feeding system, and to track how that changes from year to year within each region. And what we've seen in some regions is quite a shift from system 1 to system 2 as farms have intensified, and then in some regions quite a shift from the bale feeding systems into the PMR and hybrid systems, particularly in years where we've got difficult climatic conditions. But really the primary purpose of defining these 5 feeding systems that we use in Australia was really to provide farmers and advisors with some feed conversion efficiency targets that were specific to each of the 5 feeding systems. And we decided that, you know, one size fits all was not going to work for us because our systems are so different. And, you know, when we sat down to sort of decide what those targets should be, you know, we basically thought about, well, what's biologically possible given the constraints on cows of each of those 5 systems. So we came up with targets ranging from 1.0 kilograms of energy-corrected milk per kilo of feed for the low bale system, through to 1.6 kilos per kilo of dry matter for the TMR system. And just to please everybody, we express it in kilos of milk or grams of milk solids, whichever way you like. So they're the achievable targets, and we have slightly lower numbers that we present to farmers as sort of triggers for action if they find that, you know, they're under that threshold. So this slide really is from a research study we did down in Tasmania 3 years ago, where we looked at 60 farms over 3 consecutive years, and we put them into 3 groups of 20 farms each. And if you look at the x-axis at the bottom there, you'll see the 3 consecutive years. So this is a retrospective study. Less than 1 tonne of concentrate per cow per year, 1 to 2 tonnes, and greater than 2 tonnes. So I guess, as you'd expect, consistent with those targets that I've just mentioned, those farms that are feeding higher levels of concentrate and therefore higher total feed intakes per cow per year, you'd expect them to have higher feed efficiency, yeah, because we're diluting those maintenance feed inputs with more litres of milk. But the real story on this slide is that within each of those 3 concentrate feeding rates, you can see how wide the boxes and the whiskers are there. So the box contains the middle 50%, the middle half of all the herds, and you can see that it's wide for all of them. You can also see, if you just look at the less than 1 tonne herds for any of the 3 years, that if you draw a horizontal line across from 1 litre of milk per kilo of feed, you can see that, you know, there are certainly some herds that are exceeding that target that we've set, and there's also a lot of herds that are below it, some considerably below it. So there's a lot of variation from farm to farm. Now, admittedly, this is relying on a back calculation method. We haven't directly measured the pasture feed input. So, but nevertheless, I think that point's pretty clear. Here's another data set from Northern Australia in Queensland. Tells exactly the same story, that you know, we've got enormous variation within each system, you can use that term, within each feeding system. And here they've done it on a sort of a spot basis, 1 day in winter, 1 day in summer. In Queensland, because their forage base is so complex, they've got different forages coming in and out, and often several at a time, it's much more difficult for them to back calculate on an annual basis the way we can in our sort of more simple ryegrass clover type feed bases in southern Australia, temperate Australia. So there's a couple of challenges I guess we're all aware of when we're trying to measure feed efficiency reliably on farm, and the first one we come up against is how much of the supplements that are being fed are actually being eaten and how much of them are being wasted. And we did a study 3 or 4 years ago, and 50 farms and showed wastage from 2% to 35% and everything in between. So are we guessing those numbers, or do we have a reasonable handle on those? Is the question, I guess. And the other challenge too, obviously, is the need for us to back calculate pasture consumption due to the challenges of measuring pasture consumption directly throughout the year. And from what I understand, the method that you use is very similar to the one that we use in Australia, where we basically work out, based on the amount of milk that's being produced, what the animal's requirements would be for that to produce that amount of milk over a year, and then we know how much energy is being supplied through the quantity of and the nutritional specifications of the supplements we've fed. Therefore, the rest of the energy must have come from pasture, and hopefully we've got a reasonable idea of what the metabolizable energy value of that pasture eaten was on average, and then we can actually work out how many tonnes of pasture were consumed. But our method, we factor in probably the most sensitive things that we have to consider are body condition change over the 12 months, the feed wastage rate, which I've already mentioned, and another one, and certainly the ME value of the pasture. There's not enough of our farmers actually measure that on a regular basis, so we're often forced to use book values for that. And the other one is how far the cows are having to walk each day to and from the dairy. So they're challenges that I guess are unavoidable, but yes, it does take a bit of effort, and but it's certainly worthwhile. So we had a little software spreadsheet tool that one of the departments of agriculture had developed for back calculating pasture, and really all I did was bolt on a few extra calculations, and that same spreadsheet now provides feed efficiency as well as pasture harvest per hectare. So it sort of kills two birds with one stone. One of the motivations for creating that tool was that we did a survey a few years ago and found that there are 4 or 5 different back calculation methods that were being used across the industry by departments of agriculture and by private consultants. We plugged the same numbers into each of those tools, and we got pasture consumption per hectare figures that differed by I think it was over 2 tonnes per hectare. So there was a lot of variation there because of the different assumptions that different tools used, and that sort of motivated us to come up with an industry standard back calculation method. Now let's have a think about, well, what drives optimal feed conversion efficiency within any feeding system. And really, certainly, probably the most important one is total daily feed intake and feed quality. And the other ones that are also important are maintaining good rumen function, minimising any pasture grass gaps that might inevitably occur throughout the year, minimising feed wastage during feed out of silage and hay and other byproducts and other feeds, supplementary feeds, and minimising energy losses. What I'm talking about there is walking, cold stress, heat stress, and so forth. This diagram here just shows you that, again, those 60 Tasmanian farms, and all these farms were system 1 and 2, and you'll notice that as on the x-axis, the total feed intake per cow, as we move up to 6, 7, towards 8 tonnes per cow, we're in fact, those cows are consuming 2 to 3 tonnes of grain in slugs in the dairy twice a day. And you can, if you drew a line of best fit through all those data points, you would see that it's flattening out. And I think that sort of demonstrates a good point that, you know, I think you could probably postulate that one of the reasons for that is that you know, we're reaching the limits of good rumen function when we feed cows starchy concentrates that way. And from other data that we research data from Australia, we certainly know that PMR cows fed exactly the same diet rather than in slugs of grain and forage fed separately. Those PMR fed cows will achieve certainly higher levels of feed conversion efficiency. And to a certain extent, it comes down to maintaining good rumen function. So these are some specific strategies for optimising feed efficiency that a small group of us nutted out when we were developing the feed efficiency targets. And I very deliberately used the word optimise rather than maximise, because, you know, we can, in our enthusiasm, I think we've got to be careful that we don't encourage farmers to overreach to achieve maximum feed efficiency, because that may not be as profitable to do it that way. We've always got to remember that feed efficiency is not the only instrument on that dashboard, and it's only one of several, so always got to consider it with all the other parameters that we should be trying to optimise as well. So let's go through them, the 5 systems for a low, and we'll start at number 1 and work our way down to number 5. In a low bale system, you know, optimising feed efficiency really just comes down to having the you know, a reasonable, setting the stocking rate at a good level for the farm, great pasture selection and grazing management, using the relatively small amount of grain that we're feeding at the right times to fill the feed gaps, and trying to minimise energy losses. But as we move to System 2, we come up against issues like ruminal acidosis and being careful that we're feeding cows enough effective fibre. We've also got to think more about balancing diets for protein and minerals, and we need to think more about our transition cow feeding strategies around calving time. And if we're feeding more conserved forages as well as more grain, then we've also got to, you know, we're exposed to more feed wastage. So that's yeah. As we move from 1 to 2, we've got a few more things to think about. In a PMR ration, again, we go up another notch. We've also now got to think more seriously about diet formulations and feed quality and how we store ingredients, because we may well be starting to use a few byproducts, co-products. We've got to be, you know, confident of mixing those rations, managing the feed pad, and from a day-to-day basis sequencing the PMR feeds with our bouts of grazing day and night, and also our bale feeding twice a day in the dairy. So there's some extra challenges in a PMR ration, and then it gets even more challenging in a hybrid system, because not only have we got to do all those things we've already talked about, but farmers need to be able to transition into the summer feedlot period and back in autumn back onto a pasture-based PMR system or bale feeding system smoothly and at the right time. So the hybrid system is actually the one that probably is the most challenging. But again, you know, our feed efficiency target is higher, and so it needs to be, because the capital investment involved in these feeding systems, which is sort of really one of the things we were thinking about when we defined these 5 systems, as we move from 1 to 5, we need to be better at managing cow nutrition, and there's more infrastructure and equipment involved, therefore more capital. Therefore, we need to have better feed efficiency to enable us to get a acceptable return on those systems that have a higher cost of production. But in terms of complexity, once we go to a TMR, I sort of tend to think that suddenly things become a lot simpler because there's no grazing. Grazing's no longer part of the system. We're not slug feeding. If we just mix a good ration and we have it in front of the cows 24/7 and we control the cow's environment, then we should expect to get close to that 1.6 kilos of milk per kilo of dry matter. So yeah, specific strategies for each of the 5 systems, and I think one of the things we've got out of having a 5-system classification is that now farmers have become used to this 1 to 5 classification, and when they go to an on-farm field day or workshop, whatever you'd like to call it, and they're hearing about what another farmer is doing, they now think, well, okay, he's a system 2, but I'm actually a system 1. So actually, my paradigm is a little bit different to his. So farmers are now, I think, a bit more attuned to the differences and the similarities between their own production feeding system and those of other farmers that they talk to, listen to. A couple more points just to finish off. I think it's really important that we're realistic about how, when we change feeding systems, what that actually involves. I mean, when you think about it, it really involves changes in infrastructure. In not many cases, there's some major adjustments that the cows themselves have to make. Also, the people on the farm. So, and the way that we, the way that we manage all the day-to-day routine. So, this is a great illustration. This is a dairy farm in northern Victoria who is absolutely fastidious about his records, and someone was able to go back and calculate his feed conversion efficiency over 40 years. And as you can see, if we go back to 1962 and we go forward, we see a sort of a gradual improvement in feed efficiency, no doubt related to higher feed intakes and milk production per cow. But in 1987, as you can see there with the blue arrow, there was he put a grain silo in and went from feeding no grain concentrates to feeding, probably something like a tonne per cow per year. But you can see that it took 3 years before we saw the step change in feed conversion efficiency that we sort of hoped to see by adding an extra tonne of feed to the cows. And if you're wondering what that little drop is at the end there, well, that's another drought, okay, that occurred later in the 90s, mid-2000s. So so it does take time, and I guess we caution farmers about changing their feeding system, because often farmers want to change system for all sorts of reasons. Often just because they're frustrated or frustrated with their performance in their current system. But the last thing we want is to go from the frying pan into the fire. And if there are fundamental management problems with the current system, it's probably likely that they'll continue even if we change systems. And as we go from 1 to 5, it is a bit of a one-way ticket. Once you cross the line from bale feeding to a mixed ration system, and you've made those capital investments, pretty pretty hard to go back the other way. Sometimes farmers are happy to do that after they, you know, a few years down the track and they've paid off much of that capital. They're quite happy to park the wagon in the shed for a few months if the conditions are good and there's no need to be mixing rations. But yeah, we need to think about we need to think carefully about the business case for changing a feeding system. And here's another bit of data just to support that. Again, from the TasMilk 60 research project, what we compared here is a bit hard to get your mind around this, but what we looked at was what quartile the farms were in for their feed efficiency compared to how many years experience they had feeding concentrates. Now, just to explain, in Tasmania, feeding concentrates is a relatively new practice. So we had, you know, a number of farmers that were, you know, novices at feeding grain, and we had others that were that had 2 or 3 plus years under their belt. But you can see that 69% of the farms in the bottom 25% had less than a year's experience feeding grain, whereas 67% in the top quartile had at least 2 to 3 years experience feeding grain. So it's a learning process, I guess, is the message here, and we've just got to be, you know, acknowledge that that's the case. Finally, you know, whilst you know, when we're talking about feed efficiency, we're usually thinking about you know, how do we get more, how do we reduce our feed cost per kilo of milk. That's often one of the things we're really trying to do by improving feed efficiency. But the other thing we're also trying to do is inadvertently, really, is control our greenhouse gas emission intensity. So how many tons of CO2 are we producing per ton of milk solids? So as you can see, again, from the TasMilk 60 study, plugging that data into a greenhouse gas abatement calculator, you know, there's a reasonably good relationship there to show that as we improve feed efficiency, we certainly reduce our greenhouse gas emissions per unit of milk produced. So yeah, I'll stop there. So hopefully I've given you a bit of a concept of how we've sort of approached feed efficiency in Australia. It's an ongoing challenge to make sure that instrument is on every farmer's dashboard. But it is an important one. It's by no means the only one, but it's an important one. And if we look at every other animal industry, pigs, poultry, beef, fish, whatever you like, it's absolutely embedded in there.